Okay, so today I want to talk about fantasy. Fantasy, narrative, imagination, the imaginal, and the depth that the imaginal goes in the construction of everything that we experience. So, what we are and what the world is always inseparable from fantasy. There is no world you could ever experience that does not have some sort of fantasy, narrative, imagined perspective layered on top of it. Where there is experience, there's fantasy. And we need to recognize that. I think it's important to note the conditioned, delusional experience is actually believing the inherent reality of our fantasies. Again, unconsciously, for the most part, we tend to believe what we experience. This seems pretty standard. Like, of course, why would I not believe the world I'm experiencing? Buddhism would say that's actually delusion. That's actually, you're not seeing clearly the nature of things. And that is that the world that we experience, the self that we experience, is, you could say, a co-creation. It's dripping in fantasy, you could call it illusion. That's kind of a disparaging term, I think. But it's imbued in fantasy no matter what. No matter who you think you are, no matter what you think the world is, it's a fantasy. Always, always, always. And that does not mean that these fantasies are not beautiful and actually necessary. But we need to recognize that they're fantasies, or else we're lost. I mean, some people want to be lost. I've accepted that. But if you're sick of being lost, which I think many people are, there's a way to understand experience that actually brings you back to truth. And that is the inherent groundlessness, if you want to use the Buddhist term, shunyata, the emptiness of experience. There's no way that things are, there's no way that you are. It's all smoke and mirrors, it's all a fantasy. And when this insight sinks from a conceptual, heady insight, where, these are fun ideas to play with, yeah, that's pretty cool. When that sinks to your heart, and the deeper parts of your being, and becomes the world that you're experiencing, you're free, deeply. When you recognize that any narrative you could ever hold about yourself, about the world, is equally made up, equally a fantasy, an imagined story, narrative, experience. This includes us here in the present. This includes our story about the past, our story about the future, our story about what we are, what reality is. Everything is empty, empty, empty. And this does not bring you to a nihilistic void. This brings you to freedom. When there's the emptiness of any inherent truth, it actually opens the door to infinite, valid expressions of truth at the relative sense. Because at the ultimate sense, they're all completely empty. So there's a paradox here that I think we have to understand. That is, the ground of experience is groundless. The only real truth is that there is no ultimately real truth. And this is where the logical mind is not going to be happy, because the logical mind wants some solid ground to stand on. It's trying to always get certainty. The logical mind always wants to say it's this way or that way. It can't be neither and both. That's not going to work. That's not going to work for the logical mind. Sink into the heart, the deeper parts of the being, and the soma, the body, will resonate with these truths, because really a part of you already knows this. So, interestingly also, you can say that the desire to cling to truth as some sort of objective fact is actually a product of, we could loosely say delusion. We can also say the inherent belief in the ego, the solid, separate sense of self. When we believe in the ultimate reality of our ego, which is also a fantasy, when we are, you could say lost in delusion, actually, believing in this ego to be really what I am, then this ego, which we have identified with, is clinging to some ground to stand on, because we've solidified the ego. So this solidified ego needs some solid footing, or else, honestly, when you enter emptiness, groundlessness, the ego falls away. It's an annihilation of self, solidified self. And when the solidified sense of self, the ego, dissolves, what's left? You are everything that could ever be. Everything. Empty of separate self means full of infinity and eternity. And that is actually, it almost just logically makes sense. If you're empty of any separate designation, separation, any distinction from this reality, then you're full of everything. Empty of separation, full of everything. And this is not just, again, a conceptual insight. It is that. But when this sinks, this changes everything. And I mean, this insight, you could say, has haunted me to make this content, to make these videos, because it is something that cannot be overlooked, should not be overlooked. It is the most important thing a human being can realize about the nature of experience, of existence, of self, that it's empty, empty, empty. And this is not a belief. This is something you see with your own eyes. There's a difference. You don't read this out of a book. You don't learn this from a guru. I mean, you could. But at some point, you have to see it with your own eyes. And when that happens, it changes everything. And so, yeah, this is unbelievably important. Because as long as we're believing illusions, which is everything, we're lost. And we don't have to be. We can practice seeing in certain ways, just examining experience. When I see things like this, I enter a different world than if I see things like this. When I say I'm a winner, when I say I'm a child of God, I live in a different world than when I say, oh, I'm just Ben and I'm here in this flat materialistic existence. Different worlds. And I just made a video, a little short, about, some people in the New Age community have this fantasy that's something like, I'm a Arcturian starseed here to usher in the New Age for humanity. Made up fantasy. Completely made up. Becomes a lived experience, but it's still made up. Or we can have people that are believing in the reductionist, scientism-based reality. That's kind of, you could say, the dominant culturally conditioned narrative, where science is objectively what's true, everything else isn't. And what's objectively real is matter. Protons, neutrons, or electrons, it's all just kind of a random universe. There's no intelligence behind it. That's that kind of scientism. Again, it's a worldview based on science. Scientism-based reality. So some people live in that. Also, made-up fantasy. And then others can believe in maybe a dogmatic religious view, like dogmatic Catholicism or Judaism, Islam. And dogma means kind of believing in, my truth is inherently real and all others aren't. So people who believe in that dogmatic worldview live in that world. Also made up. Made up doesn't mean that they're not beautiful and that they serve a necessary function in the psyche of a human being. Absolutely. But when we recognize that it's all fantasy, there's almost a meta level of freedom. Freedom beyond any sort of dogma, any sort of belief in scientism, in dogmatic religion, in New Age philosophy, even in atheism, kind of an extension of materialism. All of these beliefs are completely made up fantasies. And this is difficult to come to terms with if we have a solidified ego. Because the real deep recognition of this insight of emptiness is, again, a death of what you think that you are, if you are identifying with this solid separate ego. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Tibetan teacher, has a quote, which I've probably said before in videos, but it's, the bad news is that we're all in free fall without a parachute. And the good news is that there is no ground. We're all in free fall without a parachute, yet we try to hold on to things, people, experiences, senses of self, that are also in free fall, that are also changing, impermanent, actually ultimately empty. And it's when we let go of needing to hold on to anything, any sense of self, any sense of world, any person, any experience, we are deeply, deeply free. So this freedom is, it is the ultimate ground of experience. And I say that as a knowing, actually. There is no truth except that the ultimate truth is completely groundless. Just try this out for yourself. Just, the Buddha has a phrase, ehipassiko, come see for yourself. It's not about belief. It's about do these practices, specifically sitting meditation, slow down the mind, see how things happen, see how the mind projects experience, see how the mind creates fantasy, and then we live it. When you see this over and over again, it's incontrovertible. You don't have to prove it to anybody. You don't have to even argue it. It's just like the way that things are. So again, come see for yourself. Freedom, deep freedom, awaits. And basically, the implications of this emptiness are vast. Because not only are you free from the chains that we have constructed about ourselves and about reality, but we're also free to choose whatever narrative suits us, whatever fantasy feels most deeply right. And this doesn't mean we completely disconnect from consensus reality, but we still view consensus reality as a made-up fantasy with a lot of momentum, and a lot of people are believing it. It doesn't make it true. You, as an individual, can believe any fantasy and still, adhere to the consensus fantasy of the times we're living in and not be trapped in it, if that makes sense. To see it as fantasy is the freedom. It doesn't mean it's not, relatively real. We can still play in those fantasies, but we're not trapped in them. There's a big difference. So, no matter what fantasy we feed, when we recognize that it is always going to be fantasy, imagined, narrative, we're free. We can be, in a sense, children of illusion, where we can still dance and play and explore these narratives, these fantasies that we are living as and within, while not being trapped in them. We can also then have the power to reconstruct, as in deconstruct old fantasies and build something new at any point. So the freedom here is not actually that one fantasy is better than the other. I would say that's absolutely not true. Different fantasies have pros and cons. And the freedom really comes from being able to oscillate between different fantasies at different times. Because sometimes the scientism, materialism fantasy, it's what's called for, actually. To reduce myself to matter. Doesn't mean it's objectively true. But sometimes, it's functional. In order to relate to others, in order to, again, be connected to the consensus reality of the times we're living in. But can I also access different fantasies where, again, we could say that I am the Son of God. And, that could seem blasphemous or sacrilegious to some. It's empty. It's an empty fantasy. Just as empty as anything else. Just as empty as saying I'm not the Son of God. Equally made up. And both of those fantasies lead to different experiences. And can we have that flexibility, that dexterity of psyche, of mind, to jump without clinging, without contracting around any one fantasy? That's where the freedom is. is to be able to try on different ways of seeing things, different ways of seeing ourselves in the world at will. This is, again, sort of a meta level of freedom, of agency to choose experience. And briefly, I just want to say that in this practice, there is an inevitable need for boundaries. Boundaries from others, boundaries from consensus reality. If you want to start building these fantasies for yourself, then you need to have strong boundaries against the truth that others are holding. Because they'll say, oh, the world is not like that. It's definitely like the way I see it. Okay, to you, it is. To other people, again, this is, existential liberation. So it's going to be difficult to convince everybody of it. But if you've been lucky enough to resonate with what I'm saying and understand, the immense value in it, then, again, you're going to have to build healthy boundaries against other people. Maybe not sharing necessarily everything that is happening with your organic growth and transformation of your own fantasies of self, other, and world. But again, the consensus reality says there's one way that things are, and anything other than that isn't true, and you're crazy. I think being trapped in a singular fantasy is kind of crazy. Recognize the potency of your mind and don't limit it. If you limit it, you are limited. Because we create those kinds of worlds. So if we say there's only one reality, then to you that's true. Sure, cool, go for it. It's not wrong. It's just also seems kind of, like a shame in my opinion. So again, the necessity of building boundaries. Other people can believe in whatever they want. The singular, flat, lifeless existence or dogmatic religion, cool. Let them. Absolutely let them. You don't have to believe what they believe. And once you see the emptiness of fantasy and the inseparability of fantasy from reality, you are deeply free. You don't have to convince anyone. You through actively trying on different narratives, different beliefs, you are deeply free, and you don't need to convince anyone of that. You've seen it for yourself. In a sense, you could say this functions like, working out. The more reps you do, trying on different perspectives, trying on different ways of seeing, the stronger this muscle becomes, where all of a sudden it's just like impenetrable, and you're just consistently free. You can see any, again, storied belief, even suffering, as empty, as fantasy. I won't get into that too much right now, because I think the emptiness of suffering is huge. And I think it's really potent. I want to do a big talk on it soon, maybe tomorrow. But, recognizing fantasy. They're beautiful. Everything we are, everything the world is inseparable from fantasy. And again, it's necessary for the human psyche to live these mythopoetic narratives. For me, it just seems like we've stagnated and are not living fantasies that are creative enough for the soul. So we can expand our ability to live different myths that are not limited to consensus reality. And again, we can still adhere to consensus reality to connect with our parents, our family, people we care about. But we're not limited by them. So, yep, thanks.